So we come to the end of Habakkuk. He's done questioning God. He's asked God what he's going to do about the Assyrian oppression of Israel and the Assyrian threat to Judah. And then he's asked God, Lord, how can you use the battle? And there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you were with the rivers, the mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon there from thigh to neck. Selah. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. I hear, and my body trembles, my lips to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To acquire just an irregular song. It doesn't have a regular meter or rhythm. It changes from line to line. Beginning. Verse 2. So, Lord, I've heard the report of you, and your works, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So Habakkuk makes two requests. It says, first, Lord, in the midst of the years, revive it. And that it refers to your work. So I've heard the report of you. Your work, O Lord, do I fear. This word for fear. And what the works he's referring to is the work that we see in the rest of our Old Testament, the book of Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, the book of Kings, Chronicles, and Samuel. The history of stuff. But that stuff can't be the source of our joy. First, trying to get Danny's car to work again. Which we're going to get as soon as your fuel pump comes in. Cars, it's secure and everlasting and perfect. It has to be found in the Lord. It will satisfy you like nothing else can. And it's the Lord who gives us the strength to persevere in the times of trouble. It's the Lord who enables Habakkuk to withstand these evil days, to live through them, to persevere, to continue to praise the Lord and proclaim His word. It makes us feet like the deer's, sure, steadfast, and swift. He's not going to stumble. He's not going to fall. He's going to stand firm. Makes me tread on my high places. He's going, the image, high places, mountain tops. For us, more familiar than deer, you might think of mountain goats. You can see some crazy pictures of mountain goats in places where I can't imagine how they got there, how they're standing there, on the sides of walls that are very nearly straight up and just hanging out. Their feet are so sure, steadfast. They will not slip. And if we are relying on the Lord, our feet will not slip. And wherever we are, no matter how treacherous the terrain, no matter how dangerous the fall, we will not fall if we are relying on the Lord. So, what does this matter for us? We need to act like Habakkuk. when trouble comes, and Jesus has promised that trouble will come. And in much of the world today, Christians are already in tremendous trouble, and it's coming here. No matter who wins the presidency, it's not going to change the tide of anti-Christian sentiment. We need to remember what the Lord has done. One of the great practices of Puritans was journaling. They just wrote down what God was doing in their lives. Something I've tried before. I'm very bad at it. But try and build a habit. And it's tremendously useful to those who do. When hard times come, when dark days come, to be able to look back in your own life and see how God has worked, how He has blessed you, and know that God is the same, and He still cares for you. He will continue to preserve you. But even more than that, more powerfully, more important, is remembering what God has done for His people throughout history. Habakkuk is not recounting his own personal life story. He is recounting the history of the people of Israel. And we are in a privileged position to see so much more of the work of God than Habakkuk could. Habakkuk had, from the promises to Abraham and even Noah and Adam up to several hundred years before Christ came. We have all those years in the middle. We have the return from the exile. We have the work of Christ. I was going to keep going, but I'm not really. We have the work of Christ. And we see the Acts of the Apostles, the spread of the church. We have church history even, but we see the cross of Christ. We see a God who has died to secure the eternal life of His people. What do we have to fear? We need to think back on these things. And when we face that decision, that we are all going to face someday, and it won't be as far away as we think it's going to be, where we're going to have a choice to either deny Christ or suffer greatly in this world. It's remembering the work of Christ that's going to keep us faithful to Him. It's remembering what He has done for us and the promises He has made to us. That's what will allow us to just joyfully endure plundering from property. Remember what God has done for you. Preach the gospel to yourself. Look back on the course of God's work in history. Rely on Him. Treasure Him above all other things. And wait patiently for the day of the Lord. We talked about it this morning. It's all over the book of Revelation. It's promised at the end of the Gospels. Jesus is coming again. And He will rule over all. He will crush His enemies under His feet. And we will reign with Him forever and ever. Stand firm in the promises of God. Let's pray. Father, we are a weak people. We don't have strength on our own to do anything. Help us to live in your strength. You are our strength. Lord, help us to abide in you as a branch abides its vine. Lord, help us to cling to you, to be filled with you, to live through you. Lord, to walk in your power, to live in light of eternity. to live in remembrance of the gospel, to set our minds on things that are above, to despise the things of the earth when they bring us in conflict with what you have promised us. Lord, glorify your name through us and preserve us through the days of difficulty. We ask this in Jesus' name.